Coming right now to discuss German cannabis industry, going to give us an update. Just give us an update. His analysis and facts and figures are used by people in the cannabis industry all over the world, and we're always happy to see him here. The chief economist with Whitney Economics. Let's hear it for Beau Whitney.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot. Let's see. So in prep for this speech, I was like, I wanted to kind of go back and see what I had talked about at other ICBC events. And I first started speaking here in 2019, and I had just put together a survey, a consumer survey of why people consume cannabis. And on day one, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam was presenting some of his medical research, and he was talking about the effects it had on the human body. It was pain management, inflammation, anxiety, appetite suppression, appetite stimulants, stuff like this. And when I presented the next day on why people choose to consume cannabis, it was the exact same thing that Mechoulam was researching. And so I kind of had this epiphany in the green room right before I went on, was that the consumer was ahead of the science. And I found that really fascinating. And then there was COVID canceled one of the ICBCs, but then the next one I gave a policy update, and we had, it was the first time that we had ever provided data on the total addressable market by country. And so that was a bit of a first in Europe. We also looked at the implications of German reform. We put together a forecast of the ramp. We did some standards the next year, looking at how the Czech Republic and Germany, if they teamed up, they could really set the standard for cannabis not only in Europe, but throughout the world. And then we looked at the implications of the change of the policy the next year to these cultivation associations. And now this year, I'm going to give an update. But what I wanted to convey is that ICBC has always been one of these conferences where there's a lot of cutting edge data, a lot of good thought leadership and good presentations. And so hats off to Alex and everybody at the ICBC team for putting on such an outstanding conference. Also in this prep, I like to show where the reform is and where legalization and access is, but what I didn't realize is that just in 6 years, the number of countries that have provided access to legal cannabis, either from hemp, adult use, or medical, has basically doubled. And it's grown into a €1 trillion economy. So there's been a lot of progress done over the last 5-6 years. I always like to talk about hemp. There was a really good German trade association presentation, and one of the gentlemen was talking about the benefits of hemp and how hemp plays a vital role in the cannabis community. I did an analysis that actually shows that the hemp opportunities just for 10 industries are twice the size of the global adult use and medical opportunities. And the global medical and adult use opportunities are actually going to decline because of price compression, whereas the opportunities for hemp are actually going to grow. And so look for an update on this chart in future presentations. And the market, is like a 430 billion euro market globally. That's the midpoint. I conservatively put this based upon some UN data, but based upon my baseline, it's actually a pretty remarkably sized industry. And this is broken down by region. The North American region is the largest in terms of dollars or euros, but that's actually going to decline because of price compression. And some of the reasons why Asia and Africa are so small is that people just don't have a lot of money, and so prices are much lower, and so the value of the market is lower. But when you look at it from a total cannabis consumer perspective, Asia and Africa are the big players from a consumer perspective. And so and these are relatively untapped markets. Where the action is for right now is, of course, North America and Europe. And there's been a lot of discussion today, a lot of great comments about how the focus should be on medical. And when you look at it from a total addressable market, the number of countries that have medical access and the opportunities that they represent is by far greater than even the illicit markets or the legal markets. So it's rightly stated that the medical countries are where things are and where the opportunities are as well. So getting into the US, last year there was roughly 5% growth of the US market. We're forecasting 13% growth this year, and our forecast last year was 98% accurate. So we're feeling really confident about these numbers. But if you look at the projections of roughly $60 billion by 2030, it still shows that after 16 years, by 2030, the legal market will only be 60% of the total market, meaning another 40% will be still through illicit sales after 16 years of adult use reform. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But because of the way that the regulatory structures are and the taxation structures, even at the state level in the US, it's suppressing the growth of the US market. And so in our year-over-year forecast change, we actually took down the 2025 to 2030 forecast by over $21 billion. The growth is just not there, and it's structural, and it's regulatory that's inhibiting the growth. And one of the reasons it's inhibiting the growth is that there's like 17 states that had negative year-over-year growth, negative year-over-year revenue. And so something's really not working here. You've got federal reform that's stalled, banking and tax reform that's being delayed and pushed out. You've got lack of prioritization in the US Congress, revenue declining in roughly half the states. And then you've got stress in the system where only, based upon a survey last year, only 27% of the cannabis operators were profitable, 40% were breaking even, 33% were losing money. So you've got a lack of health in the market right now in the US. License declines as a result. Out of the 40,000 licenses, almost 1,000 of them were given up. And so it's not necessarily the healthiest of markets, to say the least. And so something has to change. One of the reasons why the market's not really healthy is that you've got an abundance of supply capacity, and people aren't necessarily not growing. They are continuing to grow even though they don't need the supply. And so it's putting farmers at risk. It's crashing prices down. And I think I'll go into this in a few slides. Germany could be next on this. And so there's roughly 50 million pounds of supply that's needed to satisfy all of the demand in the US, 50 million pounds. But there's enough regulated capacity for almost 2.5 times that. And so that's the problem. The regulators and legislators and even at the federal level, they don't consider supply in their equation, and that's a mistake. So as operators, as investors in this space, you really have to look at both supply and demand in this overall market when making decisions on your operations or your investments. There's a lot of EU supply that's required. It's roughly the size of, a little bit less than the size of the US demand. And so it's a sizable market, but unlike the United States, you have to go country by country by country. And so in terms of the EU, it's evolving, it's accelerating, it's exciting. You've got Germany legalizing a year in now. You've got Switzerland with adult use reforms. You've got France that just announced some rules and submitted them for approval with the EU. You've got Eastern and Southern European countries looking at becoming a supplier into the main body of Europe. A lot of activity, and there's a certain practical approach that is refreshing to investors and operators that Europe takes that the US is not. And so I think this is really where things get compelling for Europe. And so there's essentially similar number of consumers, 65 million versus 90 million. There's still some differences in a recent report. It said 33% of European citizens had tried cannabis at one point in their life, 33%. So that's a pretty significant number, and those are some numbers that we use at Whitney Economics in a lot of our analysis. So German update, legalized, cultivation associations were allowed. They were slow to approve. I used in my analysis in this presentation 100 associations, but there's, 211 now. The debate on legalization is kind of resolved at the parliamentarian level. EU is viewed as a leader. But I don't know if cultivation associations are the best model because it limits access and it doesn't invite legal participation into the system. But clubs are kind of the model du jour in Europe, though. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the imports. And so I started thinking about this in preparation for this speech, and so I wanted to dig into this. I mean, there's, in one quarter alone, there was almost as much imported as all of 2023. That's a pretty significant number. But you might need to take a look at that and really monitor it to assess the health of the market and whether or not Germany could be oversupplied pretty quickly. So if you look at the imports, you look at the total capacity that these clubs represent, and then look at the total amount of supply that's needed to satisfy all of the demand in Europe or in Germany, this imports plus the clubs represent about 10% or 11% of the total market. And so that's a pretty significant number because you're not getting that much legal participation. So already there's more supply than there is legal participation and demand. And then if you extend this further, if you double or triple the amount of imports, and then you add more associations over time, you could very quickly, within just a few years, supply almost 2/3 of the entire market, legal and illicit. So as operators, just be wary of these import numbers that come in, and if they really explode, then you got to take corrective action as operators because the price of the supply is going to go down. There was discussion earlier about potential price compression in Germany. I'm not seeing that yet, but within just a year or two, you could see price compression. So as operators, you need to plan for that. And as suppliers into the into the German market, you need to be aware of that and plan accordingly as well. So we based our numbers on roughly 200,000 to 300,000 medical patients. But at yesterday's Tallman group, there was discussion that the 200 to 300,000 are the paying medical patients, and there may actually be another 400,000 or 500,000 that are self-paying. But if that's the case, you're still only talking about 17% of the total market being funneled through the medical, telemedicine market, the medical market, through the pharmacies, and then through these clubs. And so I'm forecasting between 800 million and 1.6 billion euros by 2030 and I'll talk about that. But the access to legal market is really key. And so the limited access and the suppression of this access is a key risk that people need to be aware of. And so I looked at last year's forecast for the total number of clubs that are needed, and year one, I put a midpoint at 201, and there's 211. So we didn't do that bad of a forecast in terms of the growth of the market. I think the number of clubs is going to, kind of slow crawl, and that depends upon the regulators here. But it'll represent roughly 2.5% to 5% of the legal market, or of the total market. And so when you look at investments, the EU is now kind of a destination of choice. You've got emerging markets, accelerating reforms. The US is kind of running in place. The EU is showing growth. The US growth is only in new markets, not even in emerging or mature markets. US is oversupplied, falling prices, compressing margins, if you have margins to begin with. And the EU is taking a pragmatic approach. This is a bit of an eye chart, but it shows that year over year, the EBITDA, the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, all of these major suppliers and major companies are showing negative growth. And so, where would you choose? Would you choose a market to invest in that's growing, that's stable, that's predictable? I pretty much would, even though you may have low growth. But it's better to have a positive low growth return than a negative return. And so this is where the action is. And so if you need data, there's not a whole lot of data out there. We're happy to supply the data, so just let us know. Yeah, for sure. So, and we're increasing our presence. Whitney Economics is going to set up a European office as well as our office in Portland, Oregon. So we're investing in this market as well. We just see it as an opportunity. So, in summary, watch the growth rates of this revenue, of the self-paying. Watch the import volumes because it could flood the market. Domestic demand is a major factor, but if you don't have access, if you only are through these telemedicines and there's not a whole lot of growth there, or if there's not a lot of growth there, then you're not going to see the growth that people are expecting and wanting. And look at this supply capacity very closely, because if it's too much out of hand, then if the supply is so great that's coming in because of all these importers from Canada, from Denmark, Portugal, North Macedonia. I mean, everybody is targeting Europe and Germany right now, so it could get out of hand very quickly. But the whole concept of slow growth and viable markets and predictable, it makes Germany still attractive, even though there are these risks. You just need to be aware of them and plan accordingly. So prep for expansion, but don't get too far over your skis, as they say. And cannabis is very local. It's very emotional for people, but act local, but you have to think globally because there's a lot of global competition, and that competition is just waiting in the wings. So that's what I have for you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. And here's my contact information. If you want a copy of these slides, I'm happy to provide them. Thank you.
One more time for Beau. Do we have questions? Questions?
I usually have some joke about rather going to, the dentist rather than listening to an economist speak. So,
Right?
I mean.
It's the same kind of, the same
We
kind
have a
of thing.
question right here.
Oh,
Hi, I'm Matija from Croatia, biodynamic grower of cannabis and other things. I'm wondering how is it still too expensive? Why is such a big competition? How much there is margins? Should the price go down? Should we reduce the prices? They're gonna be reduced by themselves, but are they too high?
So the prices in these new markets naturally are elevated at first because there's usually more demand than there is supply. But over time, when the supply balances itself out, or there's greater supply than demand, then the prices tend to collapse or go down rapidly. And that may be the case in Germany in a couple of years. And the cost of production is high here in Germany, and you've got all of these other countries where their prices have already collapsed, and so they're learning how to produce it very cheaply, and so the low-cost producers can provide a better price than people that are cultivating within the country of Germany. And so you've got South American suppliers, you've got Canadian suppliers that have all wrung out all of the costs out of their production. And so they're highly competitive on a global basis. So that's the thing to be aware of, is that, for example, in some countries around the world, like in Asia and South America, prices for cannabis on the wholesale side are $11 a kilo on the wholesale side. So that's a penny a gram. And so sometimes these costs just from the regulators could add more than a penny a gram of cost, right? And so right out of the gate, you may be not competitive on a global basis. You may be okay in a local market, but not on a global basis. So that's why I say it's important to really be aware of what your cost structure is and be aware of what's going on outside of the country.
Hey, Beau, always appreciate hearing your talks. I don't know, I know you charge money for this, and people can see this for free as part of their ticket. This place should be more packed. But anyways, I always love your insights. Question around new markets. We know Slovenia just had their big thing. Shout out to all the Slovenians and what they're doing over there. Is there any new emerging markets that you're looking at? I was just talking to someone in Brazil, and they have like 700,000 medical patients that most people don't even realize. Any kind of new markets that you're paying attention to that people should be excited about?
So that's a good question. Thank you. What I'm seeing is that people are trying to get into the game. I was just in Albania, for example. It's a small market, but they export already a lot on the illicit market. And so they're trying to bring their suppliers into the light and take advantage of exports into the EU. So Albania is like just one example of where you could develop a domestic market just for export purposes. Poland has been mentioned a couple of times today. I did an analysis for Applegar Strategies on cannabis tourism, and Poland is a major market for cannabis tourism, even though they're just mainly medical. So I'd take a look at the Eastern European countries. And then Africa is kind of very unknown right now, but some of the largest consuming countries in the world are based on the African continent. So Nigeria, major market. South Africa is alluring right now because they had a constitutional determination that it's a human right to consume cannabis, and so they're trying to figure out how to do that market. And so on the African continent, that's a good market to look at. And then Brazil, of course. Brazil is they've had their pluses and minuses when it comes to cannabis reform. They've thrown a lot of single moms that were trying to import CBD. They threw a bunch of them in jail just to get their kids medicine. And so they have a long history of law enforcement, even for CBD. In fact, a large majority of the people in prison for drug crimes in Brazil are women. And so, that's not a good thing, right, when they're just trying to get their kids some medicine. But now they're starting to see the light a little bit. And so as a result, now there's some reform. So I would look at Brazil with a certain level of skepticism and really, take a look at it, maybe prepare to enter, but it needs to have a little bit more assuredness before making a major commitment like that.
Thank you very much, Beau. And I also have a question because I'm very thankful about your information about the German associations. And I wonder if you think in the future, the associations, they have the prices are already at the moment 30% higher than in the pharmacy. In the Cannabis Association, you're not allowed to have full-time employees. You're only allowed to have like half-time employees. And there are a lot of regulations. So do you think the clubs can compete with the pharmacies when it comes to pricing in the future? Because at the moment they cannot.
Yeah, it was not surprising to hear earlier today that already out of those 211 licensees, a couple of them have already gone bankrupt. And so it doesn't surprise me because that's not a viable model. You need to have some type of sustainability in there. You need to have your employees for consistency and output. And you need to have a business model. People, policymakers tend to view cannabis very different from all of these other industries, when in reality they should just be looking at it and treating it like any other normal business. And if they did that, you wouldn't have these regulations that are so limiting with these cultivation associations. That's just a model for failure rather than a model for success. And if a policymaker develops models for failure, then what it does is it just forces people back into the underground markets, back into the illicit markets. And there's a certain sense of desperation by the operators because in reality, you're just trying to give people opportunities. And if those opportunities are not around in a year or two, then it's just flushing money down the toilet.
Any more questions from the audience? Thank you very much, Beau.
Oh, one more right there in the middle, right there.
Oh, Harry.
Let's hear it for Michael. He's have to run up all the stairs.
I'm just curious to find out what your views are on the black market, because you alluded to it a minute ago, and how is that changing? Because I know that in the United States right now, there are a lot of companies that are going back to the black market because they can't make any money in the legal market. So how has that affected your numbers, and where do you think that's going?
So, like I mentioned, if there are 700,000 telemedicine patients and medical patients through the pharmacies here in Germany already, then along with a few of the cultivation association members, that's really only about 17 to 20% of the total market. And so that means that the other 83% is still procuring on the illicit market. So the illicit market's very formidable, but it's not something that cannot be overcome. The policies just have to incentivize consumers to participate in the legal market. And a lot of times there's so much fear about this narcotic that they put so many rules and regulations around it that they really inhibit the amount and disincentivize consumers to participate in the legal market. So a lot of these policies that are set up to control actually do more harm than good, and it forces people back. So the illicit market, from our perspective, is rather predictable in nature from a volume perspective and from a dollar perspective and a supply perspective. And so you can actually chart this stuff out. But it's formidable. But like I said, it all comes down to setting up policies that invite and incentivize the consumer to participate legally. The consumer's decision-making process is there enough access? Do I have access to participate legally? And if you don't, then it's illicit. And they base their decisions on price. And so if your price is too high relative to the illicit market, then there's less of an opportunity for them to want to participate. In my studies, we've found that there is a premium that consumers will pay to participate in legal space. It's about 10 to 15%. So if the price is €1, they're willing to spend €1.10, €1.15 to participate legally. But once you get above that in terms of cost, then the amount of adoption that consumers have, the amount of conversion from the illicit market into the legal market, it slows down dramatically. And so, and this is also very, very predictable because this is called demand elasticity in economics. It's just the pricing sensitivity that consumers have. And for the longest time, academic studies said that cannabis is highly addictive and they'll pay any price to, but that's not true. And so in 2014, I kind of debunked that. And then now I've kind of rewritten the models on elasticity for cannabis. And so we published and done all this stuff. But if you keep the price down, if you give them access in stores, you could theoretically have this in grocery stores and gas stations and convenience stores and really capture a lot of the legal demand. And you could really compete head-to-head against the illicit market. So access and price are the fundamental things that will determine the success or failure of this conversion from illicit to legal.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. One more time, Beau Whitney.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, weed at the gas station. That would be wild.